Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me on today's edition of Blister Prevention Office Hours, where we are going to be looking at the features of a sports performance sock. This is quite a convoluted topic, and I've attempted to break this down with a bit of a chart or a picture to demonstrate the important points. So we're going to go through each one individually, and we'll see how we go. This is the chart we're going to look at. Now, if you can see, we've got these 8 points, and we've got some in a pink semicircle and some in a grey semicircle. The pink semicircle pertains basically to the fibres that are used in a sock, so the sock composition, whereas the grey semicircle is all about the construction technique. So it's like the weaves, the knit, the density of the padding, and the blends. So it's a really important topic because everyone always wants to just simply know what's the best sock. And we know some things. And the first thing that we do know is, I'm going to just go through this section here before we move on to the intricacies of this. So we know that sock manufacturers or brands make a lot of claims around moisture wicking and blister prevention, but the reality is there are very few blister incident studies that have been performed that compare socks. And also the wicking capacity of socks, although it's demonstrated in lab studies, it's not likely indicative of the lived experience of physical activity inside of footwear, particularly when there is limited opportunity for evaporation. So a couple of things that we know, one of the most important things is that thickness or the density of the padding seems to be pretty important for blister prevention. We know this through the studies of Herring and Ritchie. And something else that we know is moisture absorption may be more important than wicking in keeping the foot skin dry in occlusive footwear. We're going to show you that research as well. So let's have a quick look at the Herring and Ritchie studies. So these are longitudinal double-blind studies in the 1990s that showed that sock thickness seems to be important for blister prevention. So Herring and Ritchie looked at 35 long-distance runners and compared blister incidents in padded socks of identical construction but different materials. So that was either 100% cotton or 100% acrylic fibres in these socks. There were twice as many blisters in the cotton sock group, and those blisters were 3 times the size, suggesting that acrylic fibres were beneficial over cotton fibres in athletic socks. However, in their follow-up study, this time they used thin socks, so the socks weren't padded, but they were the same, either 100% acrylic or 100% cotton, and they found that there was no difference in the blister frequency between the 2 socks. So the beneficial effects of the acrylic was only seen when the sock was thick. So the authors concluded that the superior blister prevention capacity of acrylic fibres over cotton fibres depends upon sock construction. They speculated that the wicking capacity of acrylic fibres is enhanced by dense padding within the sock, enabling better moisture movement from the skin surface. However, there are potentially other ways that we can get a blister prevention effect. So the authors have assumed that it has resulted in drier skin, therefore it has reduced the coefficient of friction at the skin sock interface. But with the padding, it could be something to do with the padding in terms of reducing pressure. And we know that socks can reduce pressure, or the sock material may undergo a little bit of shear so that there's less shear that has to happen within the skin. So the thickness is important. Now, this other piece of research looked at 2 socks. One was a 50% merino wool, 33% polypropylene blend sock, and the other was a 99% polypropylene sock. This was a field study of 37 military recruits marching over 4 days, and they measured the skin and sock moisture, plus perception of temperature, dampness, friction, and comfort. Unfortunately, they didn't look at the incidence of blister formation, which would have been quite handy, because that was kind of the aim, is to understand more about how to prevent blisters due to the moisture management. However, so they compared these 2 socks, And the merino polypropylene blend was rated as cooler, less damp, and more comfortable than the 99% polypropylene sock. So despite wearing Gore-Tex boots, I forgot to mention that this was the thing. So it was in a Gore-Tex boot, which is a waterproof boot, which means water can't get in, but also water struggles to get out. So within these Gore-Tex boots, where we've got an inclusive environment and there's limited opportunity for moisture vapor to evaporate through the upper of the footwear, the wool blend kept the surface of the foot drier than the polypropylene sock in 2 foot locations. So that was the dorsal metatarsals and the posterior calcaneus. The entire plantar surface of the foot showed no difference in moisture content when comparing the 2 different socks. Maybe because, you know, the moisture will absorb into whatever the insole material is. There's less ability for the moisture doesn't really go into vapor. It just literally soaks into the insole. So perhaps it really depends on where on the foot. That's certainly what this study shows. The wool blend absorbed 2.9 times more moisture, suggesting that in boots with poor vapor evaporation, a sock's absorptive capacity is more important than its wicking ability. So that was an interesting piece of research that we really should keep in mind. Before we go into the nitty-gritty of these 8 points, I'm going to talk about these pink and grey sections and just show you some photos of fibres and knits and weaves. So we're going to have a look at the sock composition, which was the pink section, and the sock construction. So let's have a look at some fibres. So here we've got coarse wool, fine wool, alpaca, cashmere, silk, linen, cotton, and polyester. They all look quite different. Here's one showing the cross section. Cotton is top left, wool is bottom left. Here we've got nylon. So it's circular, uniform in diameter. Here we've got wool, oval to round, overlapping scales. Cotton is flat, oval, has a lumen, and there are convolutions. And then down on the bottom left here, we've got acrylic and spandex, which is like a dog bone shape. This is a picture of the CoolMax fibre, this one here. So it's described as a scalloped morphology with these channels. And the scalloped morphology increases surface area by 20%, and these channels are said to facilitate moisture movement along them. Here's a closer look at cotton. So we've got the lumen, which is the middle bit where water is absorbed into. And this one is of a relatively high micron wool, where we've got the medulla in the middle, which also can absorb water. Okay, so that's fibres. Let's have a look at construction now. I've got this little video I just want to show you so you have a little bit of understanding about how socks are made. Let me just play that now.
Socks are quite easy to manufacture. They are knitted products produced by circular machines that have needle bars in circular disposition that take the yarn and knit it, exactly like a t-shirt but in a circular tubular way. Socks can be also hand knitted if your granny is good doing it. If you're not as good as your granny, you can buy small circular knitting machines on Amazon for $30. Choose your yarn and create the sock that you want. Of course, these machines are not used for socks that you have purchased in H&M, for example. These machines are used instead. Anyway, these machines have needles that take the yarn and pull it down in order to create the knit stitch or the purl or rib. For the heel, the circle machine goes back and forth to curve the yarns in a specific direction. The fabric is a tubular fabric that comes out directly like this from the machine. After this, you sew the toe and the sock is ready for finishing and packing. Naturally, you have to pay attention to the parts of the socks. We have cuff or welt, the leg, the heel, the toe, the foot, with or without arch support, and the sole. All these parts are subject to stress, movement, sweat, wearability. When you plan on creating a new sock, that can be a ski sock for example, before knitting you have to consider a key decision: the choice of the yarn. From cotton to elastan, from polyester to wool, each yarn has different properties. A correct blend among these fibers.
Okay, that was just a quick little video I thought I'd show you. Now let's have a look at weaves. So there's all different weaves and knits that a sock can be made with. Mostly they're made of a terry or a simple jersey. So here we've got simple jersey, double jersey, duffel jersey, and a terry jersey. Terry is with the loops, like of a towel, for example. This one shows a terry fabric, and you can see that there are variabilities in the length of the loop and also the angle of the loop that can be relevant to their performance. One study looked at all of these types of knits and compared them, and it was really quite complex. This one similarly looked at the influence of the knitted fabrics. All different ways, once you've got your fibre, all different ways to basically put that sock material together. So it really is involved. Not only is the fibre relevant, but the sock material that is the result of you putting the fibres together is relevant. And that weave can be different on different parts of the sock. So it really, really is involved. Now, we're going to have a closer look at this now. I'm going to firstly look at the first three in this pink section, and then we'll look at number 4, and then we'll combine 5 to 8. Just so I want to blow them up a little bit just so that you maybe got a bit of a chance of reading them. So first of all is moisture regain. This is the ability of the fibre to attract and hold on to moisture. It's commonly referred to as hydrophilic or hydrophobic. Obviously, hydrophilic is water attracting, hydrophobic is water repelling. A few things we know about the different fibres. Wool is the most hygroscopic, so it just holds more water. It holds 30 to 50% of its weight of water via absorption, and adsorption. Absorption is the water that is absorbed into the fibre. Adsorption is what is held on the surface of the fibre. Cotton ranks second. It holds 3 times more than acrylic and 14 times more than CoolMax. And it has a 10 times longer drying time compared to the synthetics. Synthetics are hydrophobic, for example, acrylic, polyamide, which is nylon, polyester, like CoolMax. CoolMax, as I said, is a scalloped fibre with 20% more surface area, which aids moisture transportation. Then we talk about moisture wicking function, or this moisture transportation. It can be influenced by the fibre shape and the fibre density. One study showed that in terms of wicking, polypropylene has high wicking, wool moderate, and nylon or polyamide is minimal. So they have different wicking abilities. Then those fibres can swell as they deal with moisture, as they absorb the moisture. So the absorption of water into the fibre causes it to swell. This reduces airspace within the sock fabric and inhibits the movement of moisture. So this is kind of important, or it can be potentially important. When immersed in water, the following increase in swelling and volume is observed. Cotton increases 45%, it swells 45%, wool 35%, and acrylic only 5%. So the absorption of water will cause swelling of the sock fibres, and the swelling of the sock fibres reduces that airspace within the sock and inhibits the movement of moisture away from the skin surface. In terms of this moisture wicking function, it's important to realise that moisture wicking isn't some magical function that just happens and it is constantly taking water away from the skin surface and keeping it away from the skin surface. It really does depend on the moisture gradient. So if it's rained and your shoes are saturated, there's really not much of a, in terms of the insole that you're standing on at least, there's really not much of a moisture gradient. And similarly, in a Gore-Tex shoe or a waterproof shoe, we need that gradient so that moisture can move from high to low. Okay, heat transfer. So the thermal conductivity can be important. Sock fibers with high thermal conductivity can influence skin temperature. We often want low thermal conductivity for insulation. So we know that cotton has a low thermal conductivity, polyester moderate, and nylon is high. So if you're in a very cold environment, you probably don't want a high nylon content. You probably want more cotton or wool, which has a lower thermal conductivity. Right, now we look at the construction part. Coefficient of friction. So this is really probably the most involved one. So there are 3 ways that socks can affect the coefficient of friction. Moisture management, which we've kind of described. We want a drier environment, so we've got a lower friction coefficient. It also depends on the sock construction, and it can depend on the inherent friction properties of the sock itself. So a study was undertaken to determine if PTFE would reduce friction blisters when incorporated into the construction of an athletic sock at the heel, forefoot and toe area. Now in this study, blister incidence in a group of 77 university students participating in aerobics classes over 4 weeks showed that there was no significant protective effect from the PTFE sock. So could be relevant. In this study, it wasn't. I don't know of any other study that's looked at PTFE in socks. There is a few socks that have PTFE in them. But we're going to look at the coefficient of friction, which is dependent upon sock construction, knit structures and weaves. So Boussan and colleagues studied the coefficient of friction of 2 common knitted structures used in athletic socks, namely terry and simple jersey, which is also known as flat knit. So the jersey fabric is knit, it's not woven, and it has a smooth surface on one side and piles on the other. The terry fabric is also knitted and features distinct loops and soft piles of yarn on one side and a smooth surface on the other side. This research showed that terry construction generates less friction and absorbs more energy than simple jersey or flat knit construction. And the authors stated that this study supported previous research from Howarth and Rome, showing that higher density terry construction has greater capacity for shock absorption. Subsequently, 2 other investigations of sock coefficient of friction were conducted, which contraindicated those findings. Van Amber and co-workers measured both the static and dynamic coefficient of friction at the skin sock interface, and they compared 3 fibers: fine wool, mid-micron wool, and acrylic. They found that single jersey fabrics had the lowest coefficient of friction compared to half terry and terry fabric structure. They found that acrylic fabrics consistently exhibited the highest frictional forces and coefficient of friction under wet and dry conditions. All fabrics and fibers showed increased friction with increased moisture. The most important effect of fiber was on the static frictional force and coefficient of static friction of damp fabrics, with fabrics composed of fine wool exhibiting the lowest friction and acrylics the highest friction. Thinking back to the Herring and Ritchie study, they found that there were less blisters in the acrylic fabrics compared to cotton. These authors also measured fabric deformation. They compared fabrics with wool fibers, compared to fabrics with wool fibers, and the acrylic fibers deformed more under weight, when wet, which could account for the difference in frictional force between the two fibres. Also, the half terry and terry fabrics underwent more deformation than the single jersey fabrics, which may also explain the difference in the coefficient of friction forces of these fabrics. And then the other study was from Dubois, and they found that sock nick structure is more important than the sock fibre composition in terms of frictional force at the sock skin interface. This study found that terry knit structures consistently produced higher frictional force compared to the corresponding single knit jersey structures. They found that the higher density of the yarn in the terry fabrics, i.e. loops per square inch, influenced frictional force, with higher density yarn having the highest frictional force. And they speculated that the denser terry loops have more surface area to contact the skin and thus greater potential to resist skin sliding. And finally, that the terry loops have a directional orientation, which may increase friction with forward sliding while decreasing friction with backward sliding. Remember, when we're trying to reduce coefficient of friction, we're trying to encourage sliding. So it's important, this could be very important, this direction of the terry loops. They found conflicting results with friction of force in terry knit structures depending on which direction the measurement apparatus was moved across the fabric. Now, if we now think about blends, it's kind of rare to find a sock that is 100% anything. They're usually a blend of materials. For example, spandex or elastane is used for elasticity and for flexibility with the fit. Polyamide or nylon is added for abrasion resistance, so it's going to affect the longevity of the sock. Polyester, like the CoolMax, is added for moisture wicking functions. And natural fibres like cotton or wool are added for comfort, breathability, and thermal insulation. So when you have a look at socks, it's interesting to look at, just like when you go to the supermarket and look at what's in all the foods that you buy, it's interesting to look at socks and have a look at the fibre content. Just as a couple of examples, for the Injinji toe socks, their CoolMax socks can range from 28 to 85% CoolMax. So that's quite a range. 28% is quite low. Their wool socks can be between 66 and 74% merino wool. And in the Creepers toe socks, they're a merino wool sock. They're actually only 50% merino wool. So 50% of the sock is some other fibre. Now, that's not that it's a bad thing, but you sort of have to remember that socks that are called CoolMax or wool socks, they're generally not 100% CoolMax or 100% wool. We tend to need these blends for the comfort of the sock. And now we come to density and padding. So the density of the fibres or construction of the sock can influence the moisture wicking capacity. Denser weave patterns or thicker padding may enhance moisture movement through the sock by reducing compaction and preserving the airspace between fibre networks. The density of the padding also provides that pressure reduction factor as well. The study of Howarth and Rome studied the plantar shock attenuation provided for 72 hours of 5 athletic socks compared to barefoot. So those 5 athletic socks were cotton socks, wool cushion sole sport socks, acrylic cushion sole hiking socks, toweling cushion sole sport socks, and double layer cotton socks. And they found that only the wool cushion sole sport sock and the acrylic cushion sole hiking sock demonstrated significantly increased shock attenuation compared to barefoot walking. The cotton sock, the double layer cotton sock, and the toweling cushion sole did not have an effect. And they also mentioned in this study that there is other research of padded hosiery have demonstrated reduced peak plantar pressures in the forefoot of patients with rheumatoid arthritis and diabetic neuropathy. So I think that the aspect of cushioning and padding in the sock, I think we can kind of take that as definitely protective of blisters. It's possibly one of the main things that we know. And there's just so much that we don't know about how all of these factors interplay. All of these factors, from moisture management, heat, the frictional coefficient of the friction coefficient, and then these blends and weaves and the density of the sock. And that can change at different parts of the sock, as I mentioned. So it's a really complicated question when you ask what's the best sock. It's very difficult to answer, and that's the reason. I was going to touch on double socks if we had time, but we're not going to have time. So I'm just going to get straight into the Q&A. Eve wants to know more ways to prevent blisters. Well, here's a list, Eve, if you want to take a screenshot of that. Potentially a lot of ways. We have very few that have been proven with research, but there is a mechanism for many of these strategies which can be explained. That's essentially the topic of Blister Prevention University. So Blister Prevention University goes through all of those blister prevention strategies, shows you how it works in accordance with all the potential mechanisms. So every blister prevention strategy will do one or more of these things. But the key is, as a podiatrist, we need to match it to the anatomical location. So we need to understand what works best where, and that's what you get from Blister Prevention University. I just want to give you some of my experience about what works where in terms of blister prevention so that you can advise your patients accordingly. Christina asked, how to prevent blister formation before a marathon? The better question here is how to prevent blister formation at X anatomical location before a marathon. So I'm assuming that you've got a patient in front, and bear with me. I'm assuming that you've got a patient in front of you and they are seeing you because either they have a history of blisters and they don't want it to happen again in this next marathon, or they are just being very proactive and want to do what they can to prevent blisters. So the way that you would address this, Christina, is you would first ask their blister history. This is the most important thing that you can do. It's the lowest hanging fruit that there is in terms of preventing blisters. So all you've got to do is ask them and they'll tell you. It's the easiest thing in the world. Anywhere that you've had a blister before is where you're more than likely to get a blister again. Once you know these anatomical locations, then you educate your patient about how to prevent blisters in those anatomical locations with anatomically specific advice, not just general advice. If they have no blister history, you can have a look at their feet and have a look at if there's any calluses. Calluses and blisters are caused by the same thing. Calluses happen when there is time for skin adaptation and the skin gets thicker. Blisters occur when there's no time for adaptation. So you should think of calluses not as causative of blisters, but a sign or intel about where you're likely to get blisters if your activity level increases all of a sudden. Once you've got those spots on the foot, you advise on what's relevant for that anatomical location. If they have no calluses, no blister history, the last thing that you can look at is foot structure and function. Have they got a bunion, a hammer toe? Have they got cavus feet? Anything where you can predict that there might be high shear load, and then you can advise accordingly, according to the anatomical location. And if they have none of that, then you can give them general advice about shoe fit, socks, moisture management, that kind of thing. Again, if you need help, that's what Blister Prevention University is for. Evelyn asks, what is the best socks for running? I would be interested to know whether your thoughts have changed on the back of this presentation, but I think what we can say is thick socks are best for running. I say that, and I know full well that there are some people that don't like thick socks and they just want to wear thin socks. So if that's the case, I don't get too hung up about it, because really I think about and I attack blisters according to their anatomical location. Socks are going to be a generalized blister prevention strategy, but there's many, many more things that you can do to reduce shear load at specific anatomical locations. But I think what we can say is thick is probably best. And a last question from Jude: merino versus synthetic or semi-synthetic socks? And what we mean by semi-synthetic, I assume, is blend. Yeah, well, the difference is merino has better thermal insulation. Anecdotally, it has better overall comfort. And from what we know about from the research is that it potentially has better moisture management capabilities when there are occlusive footwear involved, at least on the non-weight bearing parts of the foot. Synthetic, you would probably use that. You'd probably go for CoolMax if you were wearing a shoe where moisture could evaporate and you're looking for a moisture wicking function. Perhaps you've got very sweaty feet. Synthetic, if the temperature wasn't at an extreme, so you wouldn't probably go for synthetic if you're in a very cold or hot environment, and you'd go for all synthetic if you wanted a really stretchy sock with good durability. And then semi-synthetic, that is a blend sock, is basically the best of all worlds. So semi-synthetic is the reality, and I guess we get to choose, and our patients get to choose what fiber they want to have as the main fiber type. And then at the end of the day, it all comes down to a bit of trial and error. But there's so much variability. It's difficult to compare socks because of all of these construction techniques that can be different between socks of the same fiber concentration. So let's say it has the same percentage of wool to nylon to elastane, but it might be made differently, a different knit or weave. So really, really difficult to say. But anyway, I wanted to cover this topic because it's just something that everyone asks, and this is the reason why I can't really give you a straight answer. It's because it's really, really very involved. Okay, has anyone got any questions before we sign off? Okay, if there's no questions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to link to this chart where you can see the full version, which looks like that. It's referenced. And so you can blow it up and read all these little bits that pertain to each of these points. I'm also going to have this on our pro site under office hours. So if you want to see a replay of this presentation, you can go to pro.blisterprevention.com, head over to office hours. I'll give you a link where you can blow this up and have a really good look at it. It'll have the video and it will have basically the article, the written article. So you've got all that information there to peruse in your own time, draw your own conclusions, maybe investigate it further with all of those references listed out. And yeah, just wanted to say also thanks to Doug Ritchie, who essentially did that literature review on moisture wicking socks and moisture management and just athletic socks in general. He's an authority on this subject. He's been writing about socks and athletic hosiery and blisters for many, many years. So if you've got any questions, let me know. I can always reach out to Doug, or you can message him on LinkedIn, and he'll be in touch to give you even more insights than I can today. All right, guys, that looks like it's about it. So I will see you next month for blister prevention office hours. We might talk about double socks and the research. But if you've got any topics you'd like me to cover, just reach out, let me know, and I may do that. Thanks very much. Bye for now.